Mexico is feeling the wrath of a powerful drug cartel after an army operation resulted in the death of its leader. Known as El Mencho, he was one of the most wanted men in both Mexico and the United States. His killing has sparked violence across the country, resulting in dozens of deaths, including several Mexican National Guard troops.
What you're about to hear is the reason an entire country lost sleep. A clown mask, a video, and a level of evil that even the most hardened cartel members had never seen before.
A small cabin near the mountains of western Mexico. In this cabin, a phone kept lighting up. Guess who was on the other end? The most wanted man in Mexico, Nemesio.
Fabian Morales did not just kill people. He made sure the world watched. And once you hear what is on that footage, you will understand why nobody who has seen it has ever forgotten it. This is the story of El Mencho's most terrifying hitman, the most disturbing case we have ever covered, and it only gets darker from here. There are people in this world who commit acts so disturbing that even those who have spent their entire careers studying violence struggle to make sense of them. This is a story about one of those people. Before we get into it, be aware that this script contains detailed descriptions of extreme violence, torture, and murder. If that is not something you want to read about, now is a good time to stop. His name is Fabian Morales, though most people know him by his alias, El Payaso, which translates to the clown. He became one of the most feared and most talked about hitmen inside one of Mexico's most dangerous criminal organizations. He wore a clown mask while carrying out acts of torture. He filmed what he did, and he did it all while working under the command of a man who had built an empire on the idea that the more fear you could generate, the more power you could hold. To understand how Fabian Morales became what he became, you first need to understand the organization he belonged to and the man who built it. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, commonly referred to by its Spanish initials CJNG, is one of the most powerful and most violent drug trafficking organizations in the world today. The United States Drug Enforcement Administration has described it as one of the 5 most dangerous transnational criminal organizations on the planet. It is responsible for trafficking enormous quantities of drugs into the United States, and according to the DEA, the cartel is believed to be responsible for roughly a third of all drugs entering the country by land and sea. The organization operates across multiple continents, has links to criminal networks in Europe and Asia, and has shown a willingness to use violence on a scale that has shocked even people who study cartels for a living. At the center of it all is a man named Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, better known as El Mencho. He was born in July 1966 in the state of Michoacan in western Mexico. His early life was defined by poverty. His family were avocado farmers, working the land in one of Mexico's most agriculturally rich but economically unequal regions. Michoacan produces a significant portion of the world's avocados, but for the people doing the actual labor, the financial rewards were minimal. Growing up poor in that environment with limited access to education or legitimate economic opportunity, Nemesio was exposed early on to the idea that moving drugs through the avocado trade was simply something people did. It was not considered unusual. Many people in the area were involved in it at some level, and for a young man with few other options, it was an easy thing to drift into. As a teenager, Nemesio began working in the drug trade, using the avocado business as cover. He was not running his own operation at this stage. He was working for other people, doing what he was told, learning how things worked. But the exposure to that world left its mark. By the time he reached adulthood, he had developed a tolerance for the kind of activity that most people would want nothing to do with. In the 1980s, he made the decision to illegally cross the border into the United States. He settled in California, where he became involved in drug-related crime and was eventually arrested on multiple occasions. He was deported back to Mexico, but by that point, the experiences he had accumulated on both sides of the border had shaped him into someone who was completely comfortable operating outside the law and who was willing to use violence to get what he wanted. After his deportation, he aligned himself with the Mencho cartel, one of several criminal organizations operating in Mexico at the time. The Mencho cartel was not a small outfit, but it was unstable. Internal conflicts, pressure from rival groups, and law enforcement operations gradually dismantled it, breaking it apart into smaller factions that were either absorbed by larger cartels or simply fell apart. For Nemesio, the collapse of the Mencho cartel was not the end. It was an opportunity. In 2009, he founded his own organization, At first it was known as Los Quinis, and also referred to as Los Torcidos, meaning the Twisted Ones. Within a relatively short period of time, the organization would evolve into what we now know as the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. The name change reflected a deliberate attempt to project an image of a new kind of criminal organization, one that was more structured, more disciplined, and more powerful than what had come before. To understand the model El Mencho used to build the CJNG, you have to look at another cartel that had risen to notoriety in the years before his own organization took shape. Los Zetas began as a group of former Mexican military and special forces soldiers who had defected and joined the Gulf Cartel as an enforcement arm. Over time, they broke away and formed their own organization. What made Los Zetas different from the cartels that preceded them was their militarized approach to everything. They did not operate like traditional criminal gangs. They moved and fought like soldiers. They used military-grade weapons, coordinated operations with tactical precision, and applied extreme violence not just as a means of eliminating enemies, but as a deliberate strategy to control territory and send messages. Analysts who have studied the shift in cartel violence during this period have noted that what changed with Los Zetas was the nature of the fighting itself. It was no longer small-scale gang confrontations with pistols and knives. It became something that resembled warfare. El Mencho studied this and took it a step further. He armed his organization with assault rifles fitted with grenade launchers, heavy machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, and .50 caliber sniper rifles. Footage has emerged over the years showing CJNG convoys of armed men traveling in vehicles mounted with heavy weapons, openly displaying the kind of firepower usually associated with military units. In one widely reported incident, CJNG gunmen shot down a Mexican military helicopter using a rocket-propelled grenade. This was not a cartel trying to stay under the radar. This was an organization that wanted people to know exactly what it was capable of. But weapons alone do not explain the particular kind of terror that the CJNG became known for. El Mencho understood something that he had observed in the most brutal period of Los Zetas. Activity which was that violence carried out publicly and in an extreme enough manner had a psychological effect that went far beyond the immediate victims. It created fear across entire communities, within rival organizations, and even among law enforcement. And that fear was a tool of power. Within Los Zetas, there was a man who embodied this philosophy more than anyone else. His name was Miguel Trevino Morales. He had no formal military training, which made him unusual among the senior figures of an organization built on military discipline. What he did have was an almost complete absence of any limit on what he was prepared to do to another human being. He rose through the ranks of Los Zetas on the back of pure brutality, eventually seizing control of the organization when its previous leader was killed by Mexican military forces in 2012. Under Trevino Morales, Los Zetas carried out massacres of undocumented migrants on the suspicion that they might be recruited by rival cartels. He ordered the killing of hundreds of people based on little more than fear of what they might do. His men tortured survivors and left bodies on public display as a warning. He was connected to some of the worst atrocities of that era in Mexico, including the killing of over 200 migrants and an arson attack on a casino that left at least 50 people dead. His methods of torture were so extreme they are difficult to describe in measured terms. El Mencho did not want to become Trevino Morales. He recognized that the kind of chaotic, impulsive brutality that Trevino Morales represented was ultimately self-destructive. Los Zetas eventually collapsed under the weight of its own internal dysfunction. But El Mencho did want people like Trevino Morales working for him, men with no internal limits, who were capable of anything, who could be pointed at a target and relied upon to make an example. If he had enough of those people beneath him, no rival organization would ever feel confident enough to challenge him directly. That was the logic behind the CJNG's model of violence. It was not random, it was calculated, and it led El Mencho to seek out the very worst people he could find and bring them into the organization. One of those people was Fabian Morales. To understand Fabian Morales, it helps to start with the fact that before he became one of the most feared hitmen in Mexico, he was a clown. Not in any metaphorical sense. He literally worked at a circus. He wore a costume, he wore a mask, and he performed for audiences. It is one of those biographical details that seems almost too strange to be real, but it is a fact that has been widely reported and is central to understanding both his alias and the particular brand of terror he would later become associated with. When he eventually left the circus behind, he kept the mask. Fabian Morales grew up in an environment not unlike the one that shaped El Mencho. Poverty, limited opportunity, and proximity to Tartantuad. Cartel activity from an early age are common threads in the biographies of many people who end up inside these organizations. Mexico has significant regional inequalities, and in areas where cartels operate openly, they often represent one of the most visible and accessible paths to money and status for young men who see few other options. This does not excuse what those men go on to do, but it does help explain the pipeline. His older brother was already involved in cartel activity before Fabian made the same move. According to various reports, it was his brother's influence that played a role in drawing him toward that world. His brother, who would later become known by the alias El Jaguar, was a former military man who had become a member of the CJNG. He was not a minor figure either. El Jaguar would eventually be identified by authorities as the head of a specific plaza, meaning a defined operational territory, and was listed as a mastermind behind a significant attack on police officers in Michoacan. The fact that Fabian's entry into cartel life was partly shaped by a family member already embedded in that world is a pattern that appears repeatedly in cartel histories. These organizations spread through communities and through families, and the lines between normal life and criminal life can become blurred very quickly in areas where the cartel is the dominant social and economic force. When Fabian Morales made the decision to trade his circus work for something far darker, he began his criminal career with Los Metros. Los Metros was a faction of the Gulf Cartel, one of Mexico's older and more established criminal organizations. Los Metros operated primarily out of Reynosa, a city in the state of Tamaulipas that sits directly on the border with Texas. The border location made it strategically important for drug trafficking into the United States, and it was fiercely contested territory. Operating in that environment required a certain kind of person, someone who was not easily intimidated, who could project violence convincingly, and who was willing to go further than the person across from them. Morales turned out to be exactly that kind of person, and then some. He climbed the ranks of Los Metros quickly. What distinguished him was not just a willingness to use violence, which was common enough in that world, but the specific character of the violence he used and the evident satisfaction he took in it. He recruited his own group of followers and established a shared identity for them, built around the clown mask he had carried over from his circus days. All of his men wore the same mask. This was not just an aesthetic choice. It served a practical purpose in concealing identities, but it also served a psychological one. The image of a group of men in clown masks committing acts of extreme violence was deeply unsettling in a way that went beyond the acts themselves. It was a brand of terror, deliberately constructed and consistently applied. The methods Morales and his group used to deal with rival cartel members were extreme even by the standards of an environment where extreme violence was routine. One of the practices attributed to him was burning victims alive inside barrels filled with gasoline. This method of killing had been used by others before him, including figures within Los Zetas and associated groups, but Morales applied it with a frequency and a visibility that drew attention. He was not hiding what he was doing, he was making sure people knew. It was this visibility, this willingness to perform violence rather than simply carry it out, that eventually brought him to the attention of the CJNG. El Mencho and his associates were looking for exactly the kind of person Morales had demonstrated himself to be. Someone who could generate fear on a large scale, who had already shown the capacity to lead others in the commission of serious violence, and who was not going to become squeamish when given broader authority to act. When CJNG representatives observed what Morales was doing with Los Metros, including the barrel burnings and the public nature of his operations, they moved to bring him and his group into the fold. The absorption of Los Metros into the CJNG was part of a broader pattern of expansion. El Mencho's strategy for growing the cartel involved incorporating smaller regional groups rather than simply destroying them. If a faction had capable people and useful territory, it made more sense to recruit them than to eliminate them. This approach allowed the CJNG to expand its geographic reach relatively quickly and to acquire experienced operators who already had established networks and local knowledge. Fabian Morales was one of the most significant individual acquisitions that came out of this process. Once inside the CJNG, Morales was given a formal command role. He was designated as a lieutenant within one of the cartel's operational regions, specifically within the structure associated with a figure known as Miguel Fernandez, referred to internally as LM2. This was not a peripheral role. It placed Morales within the upper tier of the cartel's enforcement structure, with his own subordinates to command and his own territory to manage. El Mencho made a specific decision that reinforced the identity Morales had built for himself. He encouraged Morales and his hitmen to continue wearing the clown masks. From El Mencho's perspective, this was sound strategic thinking. The CJNG's overall goal was to establish dominance through fear, and the image of armed men in clown masks was an effective fear-generating tool. It was distinctive, it was memorable, and it was disturbing in a way that a conventional enforcer with a gun simply was not. The masks became synonymous with a particular kind of violence, and that association served the cartel's broader objectives. By the time the CJNG had grown into the second largest cartel in Mexico, trailing only the Sinaloa cartel, led by figures including El Chapo and El Mayo, Morales had become one of its most prominent and most feared commanders. The organization he belonged to had come an enormous distance from its origins. It had started, in the most literal sense, with avocados. El Mencho's background in the avocado trade and the agricultural networks of Michoacán had provided the early infrastructure through which the cartel began moving chemical precursors and eventually finished drug products. From those agricultural roots, the organization had grown into something that the DEA considered one of the primary sources of drug supply into the United States. Running an organization of that size and complexity requires more than weapons and money. It requires a certain kind of internal culture, one that maintains loyalty through a combination of incentives and fear. For the people at the top of the CJNG, the reward was money, status, and protection. For the people further down the chain, the calculation was often more basic. You could be inside the organization and receive a degree of safety and income, or you could be outside it and be vulnerable. In regions where the cartel was the dominant power, that was not really a free choice. Many of the young men who ended up as low-level cartel members had grown up in communities where the cartel was simply the way things worked. They saw it as the only available path to anything resembling a decent life. Cars, money, respect from peers who had nothing, these were things that cartel membership could provide in a way that legitimate employment could not for people without education or connections. This is the environment in which Fabian Morales rose to prominence. It does not make what he did understandable in any moral sense, but it does place it within a context that explains how a person can move from performing at a circus to commanding a group of men who committed acts of torture on camera. The world he operated in had its own logic, its own hierarchy and its own set of values, and within that world what he was doing earned him status and recognition. By the early 2000s, a new dimension had been added to the way cartels projected power. The widespread availability of smartphones and social media meant that videos of cartel violence could be filmed and distributed quickly and at scale. This changed something fundamental about how organizations like the CJNG operated. Violence that had previously been witnessed only by those directly involved or by communities living nearby could now be shared with an audience of millions. Some of this happened on mainstream platforms before being taken down. Much more of it circulated on darker corners of the internet, where content moderation was either minimal or non-existent. For Fabian Morales, this new reality was not a complication. It was an opportunity. He had already shown a tendency toward performing violence rather than simply executing it. The ability to film and distribute. That violence fit naturally with the approach he had already established. What came next was something that would place his name, or rather his alias, in a category occupied by very few people. There are certain things that, once known, cannot be unknown. There are images and descriptions that settle into the mind and refuse to leave. What follows is a description of events that fall firmly into that category. The details are serious and they are disturbing, and they are included here not for shock value, but because understanding what Fabian Morales actually did is necessary to understanding the full weight of what the CJNG represents and the kind of human being it is capable of producing. If you would rather not read further, that is a completely reasonable decision. At some point in the early to mid-2000s, a video began circulating in the darker corners of the internet. It eventually became one of the most widely discussed and widely referenced pieces of cartel violence footage ever to surface online. The video is commonly referred to by the title Quiero agua, which translates directly from Spanish as I want water. It is not a long video. Accounts of it describe it as being in the region of 30 seconds to a few minutes in length, depending on the version being referenced, but the brevity of the footage does nothing to reduce its impact. If anything, the short duration makes it more concentrated, more immediate, and harder to process. The video shows a man in the final stage of his life. He is alive when the footage begins, but only just. The individuals responsible for what has been done to him are the CJNG clown group associated with Fabian Morales. The victim is believed to have been a member or associate of a rival cartel, most likely connected to La Familia Michoacana, though his identity has never been formally confirmed. He was never named publicly, and his family, if he had one, may never have known exactly what happened to him. What had been done to this man before the camera started recording is almost beyond description in measured terms. The people holding him had removed the skin from his face and from other parts of his body. He was still alive when this happened. He remained alive when the filming began. The human body has remarkable and deeply unfortunate capacities for survival, even under conditions of catastrophic physical trauma, and whoever carried out what was done to this man clearly understood that. Keeping a victim alive through the most extreme forms of physical damage requires a certain kind of knowledge, and it is a knowledge that Morales and his associates had clearly developed. The title of the video comes from what happens during the footage itself. The men surrounding the victim taunt him. They ask him questions. They mock him. And at one point, in what appears to be an act of deliberate cruelty rather than any genuine offer of relief, they ask him if he wants water. The victim responds. His voice, according to every account of the video that has been documented, is almost unrecognizable as a human voice. Raspy, weak, barely audible, it is the sound of a person who is suffering so severely that even the act of speaking requires effort that should be physically impossible. The exchange between the men and their victim is one of the most commented upon aspects of the footage. At one point, the men appear to ask the victim to acknowledge who is responsible for what is happening to him, essentially demanding that he recognize Morales or the group by name even as he is dying. Multiple people who have reviewed translations of what was said in the video have noted this detail. The question of why that matters, why recognition from a dying man would mean anything to the people doing this, is one that does not have a comfortable answer. It speaks to something deeply abnormal in the psychology of those involved. A need to assert dominance and identity even in a context where there is no possible challenge to their power. There is a significant debate about the precise role Fabian Morales played in the video itself. It is not entirely clear from available accounts whether he was one of the men directly carrying out the torture, or whether he was present in a supervisory capacity, or whether he was the person behind the camera. What is not in dispute is that the video is connected to his group, that the men in it are wearing the clown masks associated with his crew, and that the act was carried out as part of operations linked to him and to the broader CJNG structure he was part of. The video was shared online and eventually found its way onto platforms and sites where it attracted significant attention. YouTubers and online commentators who have discussed it without showing the footage itself have spoken about the psychological impact of watching it. One person described the experience of having seen it as something that disrupted their sleep for weeks, with sounds from the video replaying involuntarily. Another described a friend who had developed a habit of watching real-life violence online, and noted that over time the friend had changed in ways that were difficult to explain but clearly negative, becoming desensitized and detached in ways that had not been present before. These accounts are consistent with what researchers who study the psychological effects of exposure to graphic violence have documented. The human mind is not built to absorb material of this nature without consequence, and repeated exposure does not simply build resilience. In many cases, it creates a kind of psychological numbing that has its own set of serious effects. This is worth dwelling on for a moment, not because the audience for this script needs to be lectured, but because there is a real and documented risk associated with seeking out this kind of content. The video in question is still findable if a person looks hard enough. It circulates in corners of the internet that exist specifically because mainstream platforms have removed it. The fact that it is difficult to find does not make it harmless to find. Every credible account from people who have seen it suggests that it is the kind of material that does not leave you. There is no useful reason to watch it, and there is a genuine risk that watching it carries. The advice here is straightforward: do not go looking for it. The broader significance of the Quiero Agua video goes beyond its contents. It represents something important about the evolution of cartel violence and the role that media and documentation play in modern criminal organizations. The CJNG was not the first cartel to film its activities and distribute the footage. Los Zetas had done this before them, and the practice had become increasingly common across multiple criminal organizations in Mexico and elsewhere. But the CJNG under El Mencho had developed the practice into something more systematic. Violence was not just being recorded, incidentally, it was being staged, performed, and distributed as a form of communication. The intended audience for these videos was multiple and overlapping. Rival cartel members were one audience. The message to them was direct and unambiguous. This is what we are capable of. This is what will happen to you if you cross us or challenge us. Law enforcement was another audience. The message there was also clear, though more complex. It was partly a demonstration of power and partly a form of intimidation directed at individual officers and their families. And the general public was an audience too, both locally and nationally. In communities where the CJNG was seeking to establish control, footage of this kind sent a message about the consequences of resistance or non-cooperation. The psychological dimension of this strategy is something that security analysts and researchers who study organized crime have written about extensively. The use of extreme public violence as a tool of social control is not new. It has historical precedents across many different contexts, from public executions in earlier centuries to the various forms of political terror used by state and non-state actors throughout the 20th century. What the CJNG added to this tradition was the distribution mechanism of the modern internet, which allowed the reach of a single act of violence to extend far beyond the immediate geography of where it took place. Fabian Morales operated at the intersection of all of this. He was someone who had built a personal identity around the performance of violence. The mask was not just a practical tool for concealment. It was a costume, a persona, a deliberate construction of a character that was meant to be terrifying. The clown in most cultural contexts is associated with entertainment, with childishness, with something fundamentally unthreatening. The act of taking that image and filling it with genuine horror is not an accident. It is a deliberate inversion, and inverted symbols carry a particular kind of psychological weight precisely because they subvert something familiar. The reaction to the Quiero Agua video when it circulated was significant. It drew coverage from journalists and researchers tracking cartel violence. It was cited in discussions about the CJNG's methods and about the broader problem of cartel-produced violence footage online. It contributed to the reputation of El Payaso as one of the most extreme figures within an already extreme organization. And it raised questions that are genuinely difficult to answer about how a human being arrives at that place. How childhood, environment, poverty, exposure to violence, and whatever internal factors are unique to an individual combine to produce someone capable of doing what that video documents. There is no single clean answer to that question. What can be said is that Fabian Morales did not emerge from nowhere. He came from a specific place, a specific community, at a specific set of circumstances. He was shaped by an older brother already embedded in cartel life. He operated within a structure that actively rewarded the worst expressions of human behavior. He existed in an environment where the kind of violence he specialized in was not just tolerated but celebrated and promoted as a form of professional achievement. None of that makes what he did defensible, but it does make it, in a limited and uncomfortable sense, explicable. The video exists. The man in it suffered in a way that most people will never be able to fully imagine. And Fabian Morales, wearing his clown mask, was responsible. That is the core of it, stripped of everything else. For all the fear that Fabian Morales generated, and for all the apparent untouchability that came with operating inside one of the most powerful criminal organizations in Mexico, his time outside of a prison cell eventually came to an end. The circumstances of his arrest are worth examining because they reveal something about both the limits of cartel power and the lengths that law enforcement had to go to in order to bring someone like him in. In October 2019, the CJNG carried out a large and coordinated ambush on police officers in Michoacan. 13 officers were killed. It was not the first time the cartel had targeted law enforcement in this way, and attacks on police and military personnel had become something of a signature tactic for the organization. The CJNG did not shy away from direct confrontation with the state. In some respects, it actively sought it out, viewing successful attacks on security forces as a demonstration of power and a warning to anyone who might consider taking action against the cartel's operations. But this particular ambush turned out to be a miscalculation. Rather than intimidating the authorities into backing off, it provoked a response. The Michoacan police used the attack as the basis for launching a significant sting operation targeting the CJNG structure in the region. In January 2020, that operation produced results. Fabian Morales, El Payaso, was arrested along with several of his associates. The clown mask that had become so closely identified with his particular brand of violence did not protect him when it actually mattered. The same operation that resulted in Morales' arrest also led to the death of another significant Joanne G. figure. She was known as La Katrina, and her story runs in a parallel line to that of Morales in several ways. She had joined the CJNG in 2017 at the age of 19 and had risen rapidly through the organization's ranks to become a hit squad commander. El Mencho had actively encouraged her ambitions and her capacity for violence, and she had taken on an operational role that included sanctioning attacks on police officers. It was later established that she had given the direct order for the October 2019 ambush that killed the 13 officers in Michoacan. The authorities had a recording of her voice issuing that order, which left very little room for any legal defense. When military forces raided her safe house, she was shot during the operation and did not survive. She died from her injuries in a helicopter on the way to hospital. The arrest of Morales also brought into public focus the role of his brother within the same organization. His brother, known by the alias El Jaguar, was a former member of the Mexican military who had transitioned into cartel work and risen to a command position within the CJNG. He was identified by authorities as the head of a specific operational plaza within the cartel's structure and was also designated as one of the masterminds behind the attack on the Michoacan police officers that had triggered the sting operation in the first place. The fact that two brothers had both reached senior command positions within the same cartel is notable, though not entirely surprising given how these organizations recruit and retain members through family and community networks. The news of Morales' arrest made headlines across Mexico. For a country that had spent years watching the CJNG expand its reach and increase its body count, the capture of one of its most recognizable commanders was a significant moment. It was not the end of the organization, not even close, but it was a demonstration that the cartel's senior figures were not permanently beyond the reach of the law. Morales is currently serving his sentence, and it is considered highly unlikely that he will ever be released on parole. He does not have access to the kind of resources or international legal leverage that allowed figures like El Chapo to engineer escapes before ultimately being extradited to the United States. Even El Chapo, one of the most powerful and wealthy cartel figures in history, ended up spending the rest of his life in the ADX Florence Federal Prison in the United States, widely considered one of the most secure correctional facilities in the world. For Fabian Morales, the prospects are considerably more limited, but the story does not end with his imprisonment. The CJNG continues to operate. The DEA has stated that the cartel is responsible for a substantial portion of the drugs entering the United States and has described it as one of the most significant threats to American national security in the context of drug trafficking. There have been serious discussions within American law enforcement and political circles about designating the CJNG as a foreign terrorist organization, a step that would have significant implications for how the United States could legally respond to the cartel's activities. The broader war between the CJNG, rival organizations like the Sinaloa cartel, and the Mexican and American authorities shows no clear sign of ending. Analysts and journalists covering the situation have noted that the cartels have, in certain regions, effectively supplanted the legitimate government as the dominant authority. They use violence as a negotiating tool, creating enough chaos and instability to then approach local politicians with an offer of negotiated peace in exchange for cooperation, or at least non-interference. It is a cycle that has proven extremely difficult to break. The legacy of Fabian Morales within that broader picture is a dark one. There are people who spent time in his organization who are still operating. The methods he used, the culture he helped reinforce, and the example he set did not disappear when he was arrested. Violence that is performed and filmed and distributed has a life beyond the immediate moment. It continues to circulate, to influence, and in some cases to inspire people who are looking for exactly that kind of model. What can be said with some degree of cautious optimism is that his arrest matters. It demonstrates that even the most feared and most protected figures within these organizations are not untouchable. Law enforcement agencies on both sides of the border continue to work toward dismantling the CJNG's command structure, and every arrest at the senior level makes the organization slightly less stable and slightly less capable. Whether that is enough and whether it will ever translate into something approaching a genuine resolution to the violence that has defined this period in Mexican history remains to be seen.